Well, morning all. Hopefully I'll keep you entertained while you eat your breakfast anyway, but I'll be very relaxed in this, so if you have any questions as we go through, please don't hesitate to ask. I know we've got a panel later on, but sometimes it's useful to do it as it's current. What I'm going to do, and I was given a very open topic to speak on, was give you a little bit about UniQuest's background, where I've been working for the last 16 years until February this year. The sorts of things that we did, and then the observations that I've got on a number of observations from the things that have worked, things that haven't, about how to move technologies from idea into the marketplace. So talking about UniQuest first, I guess UniQuest built over time to work with 6 institutions, universities and public sector research organisations. And so that provided a good source of innovations coming in from all of that research community. That led with the development programs and education programs we put together to a steadily increasing stream of innovations, ending up around about 500 or so in 2011, that were then triaged through a process of increasing due diligence as the process, starting with just a simple check on the basics, working through to more detailed due diligence, actually having people engaged, checking markets, patents, that sort of thing, and then right to the very end where a lot of detailed due diligence and packaging was done to present them to investors or industry partners. In that process, it was helped enormously with proof of concept funds. This amounts up to $50,000 that were used to try and demonstrate the commercial potential or move the innovation further towards the marketplace to make it attractive to industry partners or investors. This, with the support of the Queensland government for a number of years, was up to between $500,000 and $1 million a year of commitment. And investing in somewhere between 20 to 40 projects a year from those 6 universities to bring them forward to get into the point where they're ready to seek investment for the next size. As a result of that, UniQuest have created something like 70 companies and raised now over $500 million to take those technologies into the market. So there's quite a deal of activity and experience that's come from that, but hopefully I'll share some of that with you. What is the tragedy of the whole thing, though, is that UniQuest, or UQ, is the only university in Australia that's actually working on this basis. And you can see from this chart, this is a government survey. The blue line is UQ on things such as provisional patents filed, license income, investments in startups, that the rest of Australia is lagging a long way behind. And the tragedy is that if the rest of Australia was operating at the same level as UniQuest was, then there would be a burgeoning high-tech industry in this country based on research from public sector research organisations. In fact, it got to the point that I think the last year that was not included in this survey, we understand that something like 2/3 of all the money that was raised for university startups in Australia was raised through UniQuest and its startups. So the result of that is that there's now over $3 billion worth of products sold annually around the world that use technologies that were commercialised by UniQuest. Probably the best known one is the Gardasil vaccine, the cervical cancer vaccine, which has now had something like 20 million people have been injected with it, and of those, something like 20,000 of them would have died of cervical cancer at some point in the future, but for this vaccine. Technologies such as magnetic resonance imaging technology, that is a UQ technology that's in 2/3 of the world's MRI machines around the world, surge protection devices, software, social sciences programs. There's a whole suite of things. So with that sort of background, what I thought I'd do would be just give you a few observations on the sorts of things that I found important in that time. Thought, you always try and put an acronym around it, so I thought I'd put it into three categories: people, innovations, funding and locations. Unfortunately, the acronym is PIFL, but I'm sure you'll take that with a bit of a grain of salt and see how you make up your mind at the end of the talk whether you think it's PIFL or not. So starting, I think people, and I think everyone pretty well agrees that people are the most critical element of any development or any investment program. And if you go through the key people who are involved, nothing happens without the innovators in terms of coming up with the original idea, whether it's a new business model or a new invention or a piece of technology. They're the critical point to success and the starting point. And so they're obviously an extremely important part of the process. But they're also people who come from a wide range of environments. And I've dealt mostly at UniQuest with academics who come from a career in the academic world, which is very different from the business world. And that brings with it different expectations, different value systems, different morals even, that need to be dealt with. But the similar things can apply to inventors from the community at large. Someone might have been a fantastic tradesman, but they've come up with a brilliant idea to do something differently, and they're moving into a new sphere where they're not familiar with all the activities that are needed to build a business and take things forward. So you find quite often that the innovators have overinflated ideas on the demand for the product or the invention they've made, how difficult it will be to get it to market, the obstacles you'll find on the way, and then of course the value of the thing at the end of the day. And that's always a tough point to start with. So critically, it's managing and those relationship with the innovators is really important. And really what's the most important thing is to understand what is it that's really driving those innovators. And everybody's different. So we've seen, a lot of them are just driven by passion for the invention they've made, how it's going to improve the world, and their main focus is moving it out. Some of the researchers that we've dealt with are more driven by how much research funding can I get to advance my research career based on this innovation. Some of them are driven by control. It's their idea and they just want to make sure the most important thing is to maintain control of it. And some of them are driven by just it's another way to do something that I really want to do. And in fact, I remember vividly a startup I was associated with in the US that went on to be a very successful large company making gear and shipping it all around the world from an ultra-modern factory. And right at the front of the factory, as you drove past on the left as you went into the building or into the whole facility, was a woodworking shed. And the founder of that, all he wanted to do really was to make things in wood. And so one of the conditions for getting it all on the way and gaining the support of this guy was that we agreed that he had to build a woodworking shed for him right out the front, maintain it, provide power, look after it, all that sort of thing. And every day he'd come in and go into the woodworking shed. And if we had a problem, you'd go and talk to him and he'd more than help you, etc. But that was what was driving him. He wanted to be able to make things in wood. So it's really a case of getting inside the innovators' heads. What is it that's really driving them? And then structuring a package around them to make sure that they can deliver. And a lot of investors think, and we found this quite a lot, we're providing the money, we'll call the shots, people should just fall into line because if they don't, we won't provide any more money. And that's a very short-sighted view in our experience because any early stage development program is a partnership. And it's not going to get there without the support of the innovators, it's not going to get there without the support of the money. Everything has to be aligned, and that means you've really got to work with the idiosyncrasies of all the people you're dealing with, whether they're investors or inventors or researchers or whatever. But in saying that, we found it was really critical to be looking all the time at role transition and positioning and getting that set up at the right time. Because the person who's the brilliant inventor can make has incredibly innovative ideas, often is not the person who's really going to build the business and take it forward with the management skills and the entrepreneurial skills that need to do that. Sometimes they are, many times they are in fact, but in many cases they're not, particularly in the research community. So you need to be working carefully with them and building those strong personal relationships that will enable you to move through the phases of the business as it grows and needs different skill sets and different capabilities to take it forward. So probably the most important person in that role is the CEO, the first CEO of the venture. Now, in many cases that will be the innovator themselves, in which case it's important that either the chairman or another person on the board or an investor is the one who develops the relationships that helps make things forward. But if you have a situation where you're able to hire a CEO and work with the innovator, the most important thing for that CEO is obviously being able to raise funds and build the business. But the critical role as well is someone being able to work with the innovator to make sure that really that relationship works and you get the most out of it. Because without that creative spark and that in-depth knowledge of what the technology behind the startup is, you can get into trouble. And I've got a classic example of a company which is now a public listed company, going extremely well. The first CEO of the business had a major falling out with the innovator. The result that the ideas that the innovator put forward were just disregarded because they came from the innovator in some cases. Some of them deserved to be disregarded, but some of them didn't. And as a result of that, the company missed a major bit of work that I think set it back 12 to 18 months in its capital raising program, because that was the critical question being asked by the inventors, and had been asked by the innovator 18 months before that and dismissed by the CEO because of the personal drama between them. So again, it's really important that the CEO is someone who's able to get on with the innovator and work with them. And contrast that with the second CEO of this particular company, who has developed an absolutely fantastic relationship with the innovator, is drawing out the best ideas, improvements and ideas for new products from the innovator, and has done things like flying the innovator over to a launch of the product in the US. Now, there was no need technically or commercially to do that, but that really made the innovator feel valued, part of the team, and wanting to be working and supporting the venture going forward. So again, another critical element in just managing that innovator and that relationship. Other critical people are investors, and it's important always as an investor to work constructively to move forward and adding value. But don't always be too fussy about exactly how you add value. The most important thing is the venture, the relationships in the organisation are stable, everyone's working in the same direction, and at times you have to be prepared to let things stare off a little bit off where you think it should be going if you're confident you're going to end up back in the right place. I guess the last thing there is that you want to make sure your investors or your partners there have integrity. And no matter how tough it is at times in raising money, you never want to drop those standards. And a story that I mentioned at the Angels Conference, some of you may have heard or will have heard, about one startup that a southern university was involved with, and they were unable to raise funds, but they finally found an investor who looked a bit sort of sus, but they needed the money, so they took it. About 6 months later, the company was in trouble. It hadn't delivered on its promises, and the person who raised the funds had a visit at 2 a.m. in the morning from two very large men with baseball bats, saying, we need a cheque tomorrow or we'll be back. So that's the extreme of making bad choices in partners, but again, the old principle of making sure that you are going in, working with people who you're comfortable and have the same standards and integrity as yourself. So I guess the last group I'd like to talk about in terms of the people are boards. A lot of small startups, I think, try to keep the board really small and tight because that's easier to manage and easier to handle and that sort of thing. But a good board can add enormous value to a startup. Just it's the old story of all the psych experiments show that a group of people are so much more effective than one or two in terms of generating new ideas, looking at things from different perspectives, and avoiding the dreaded groupthink, which can be the end of many ventures. It may not be necessary to establish a formal board, the system we've used quite effectively is set up an advisory board, and then the formal board can be quite small, but it really needs to listen and open and share with the advisory board. And then the people who obviously work well on the advisory board can ultimately be taken on board to the permanent board when that goes forward. Please, Bob. Yep. 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 Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. Well, it's always a tricky issue, because once you are deemed a director of a company, you are liable for what happens in that company. My understanding, and this is really a legal question, but rather than a commercial one, but my understanding is that when you are seen to be directing the company, you are a director. So even though you may not be a formal director, if you're of that company, if you're in a position to really direct the major decisions of the company, so then you can be deemed a shadow director. So you have to be a bit careful. But there's a number of legal things you can put in place to try and enforce that separation. So you make it a document, like you have a charter for the advisory board that says it's advisory group only, and it's very clear that the company's under no obligation to listen to what the advisory board says or take any action on it. That sort of thing. You can clearly define the roles, have a board that formally makes the decisions rather than the advisory board recommends something. You don't want the company to then just go ahead and do it. You then need a formal board resolution that says, okay, this is the decision, yes, we approve it, so that it's clear the decision is made by the board and doesn't just automatically flow on from the advisory committee. So that's, but you don't want, yes, so you don't want all the responsibility but none of the power, so you've got to watch that. But one of the other biggest questions then that we faced all the time was, do you have the innovator on the board of the company? Again, it's a very personal matter for the innovator. So some innovators don't want to be on the board of the company, particularly when it's explained to them how the liabilities and how they can be personally liable in the worst situation, etc., etc. And some of them just want to go on and just develop the product and you handle all of that. But others you find do want to be on the board and want to be part of it. I've seen situations where both situations where it works and it hasn't. So, for example, we had one where the innovator really wanted to be on the board of this company, and the investors said, absolutely no way, we don't want the innovators on the board. We want to have our discussions free of that, and we'll deal with the innovators at an arm's-length basis. And that innovator basically lost interest, and the company failed. That's the worst case. Another case, similar situation, the innovator really wanted to be on the board of the company, this is now a very successful company making a hydrogen storage technology that's raised about $10 or $15 million. The board again just said no way. This particular person didn't have the skills necessary to be a director. But the difference there was that the innovator had you might call an apprentice, or a younger person working with him, who was able to pick up when the innovator just again lost interest and headed a different direction. The younger person had the basis for the technology and was able to take it forward with the company, and it went on to be very successful. So I guess the lesson is that if you've got an innovator who really wants to be on the board, you've got to be very careful about saying no. And if you do say no, you want to have a backup plan to make sure that you can get the basis of that innovation and keep it in the company regardless. So my leaning has been, initially it started off by, you don't want the innovators on the board, because particularly with research academics. But I guess over the years I've seen so many that haven't worked because the innovator wasn't engaged with the company at the end of the day. That I think it's probably better, if they really want to be on the board, to do that, unless you've got the alternative plans. But make sure that you're putting in place the processes for when the time is right. Or two things. Firstly, to educate them on how to be a good board member. And that's things such as sending them on the AICD course. That's worked very well on a number of occasions for us to educate an innovator on what's involved in being on a board. Making sure they have a good mentor that they relate to and trust, so that's someone they can talk to about issues on the board, how you deal with it, how you work with them. And then you also, again, do things like have a fixed term agreement that I'll be on the board for 3 years or whatever the year is, and then prepare people for transitions as it comes, as and when. So again, it's not an easy issue. When you're dealing with people, it's always down to what are the drivers of those people, what are their hot buttons, and how do you work with them to make sure it all comes together in the whole thing. And then I think probably the last thing that I think really works well, that I've seen work well, is having one or two independent people on that board. People who not actually got a lot of money into it, not a people who are engaged personally in it but who can sit back without emotion and form a judgment or advise the group or talk to the group about it. And that's always been a valuable thing, because often you get into groupthink, you get into people just fall in love with the technology, the opportunity, and the rational judgment can be slightly skewed. If you've got someone who hasn't got any of those commitments in there, then you can always, hopefully, if they're the right person, get the views coming through that lead you to the right decisions at the end of the day. So that's covering off on people. I'll move quickly to innovations themselves. And one of the most critical things that we found was, is the innovation reproducible? And again, I've seen a number of startups fail after money. One of them had a couple of $1 million, because at the end of the day, they couldn't reproduce the original product that was the basis for raising the money. So that's really a challenge. So make sure that you can reproduce the invention or the innovation and get that through there again. I guess the next thing is to always want to be thinking about what we call the killer experiment. What is the thing that we want to do that is, what is the thing that's most likely to kill this particular project or this particular company, and then do that and see if it does. So, because the worst thing you want to do is, in this space, is have all your resources focused into something which isn't going to go anywhere. So the idea, you want to try and make sure that those that have life survive all the tough tests and keep going, and if they're not going to survive the tough tests, then just get out and move on to the next thing. Patents is also important, and a mixed blessing. They can be very expensive and not particularly valuable, but they're useful, I think, in capital raising and in creating a position where you can negotiate with other parties, where you actually have an IP position. Talk about location, and that's critical. Obviously, we all know about markets and the size of markets and how big it is to go there. But the thing that people often don't think about is capabilities. We had a startup that was developing a surge protection device, electrical surge protection device. Trying to do it in Australia, and just getting along, struggling along. Moved it to the US, and were able to hire a different calibre of people, basically people who understood the solid state technology, came up with new and innovative approaches, and totally revamped the technology behind the company that led it to go on and be successful and acquired. And so people think in terms of location, it's markets and money, but think about capabilities as well. That's just as important. I guess the last thing then is funding, and we all know the funding challenges. As angel investors, always got to be thinking about where is all the money going to come from to take this when I run out, when my pockets end. That's critically, obviously, venture capital, floating, or industry. And I think in this environment, the best bet's largely industry. Go out, talk to the right partners, get involved with them early, tell them what you're doing, tell them when you hit the milestones. They're not interested now, but they will be down the track once you've proved it up further and make an offer. So I think that's an important area. And the other thing to be aware of in this space when you're dealing with venture capital industry is the ratchet clauses, which can see your interest diluted very dramatically when there's a problem, even if the company comes through the other side and fixes it. And have a classic example of one company which we expect will be sold this year for over $300 million. After hitting a couple of roadblocks, the original interest was diluted right down by ratchet clauses because there was a down round which restructured the shareholding. That original shareholding, fortunately, UniQuest had some more shares from a subsequent transaction. But the original shareholding was worth very little because of that ratchet. So again, it's something to be very careful of. So just to wrap up then, I said at the start, piffle maybe. Hopefully that's given you a few ideas. The main thing, the other thing for P, of course, is persistence. And I've not seen a single company in the whole time I've been doing it that hasn't had significant roadblocks at some point in its time. It's persistence, creativity that solves those issues, gets past the roadblocks and leads to a successful venture, combined with the will of the team, the partners behind it. Just keep fighting and keep battling on. You do all of that, you can have some very successful companies, and that'll be good for the future of this country. Thanks.